After winning this year's Masters, a lot of people have been comparing Yan Bingtao to 6-time world champion Steve Davis. But is that a fair comparison? Well, from the outside, the two of them do at least appear to be quite similar, as Yan clearly has a great understanding of the game. So if we have a forensic look at his technique, will we be able to find out? When I first started to analyse Yan's technique, something took me by surprise, but what was it?
Well, that was how much he seemed to concentrate on each and every shot.
This is one of the most common things people want to know when they're learning to play the game, and it's,
what should your eyes be looking at when you're going to play the shot? Well, that can change from player to player, but with Yan,
you can be in no doubt that his eyes are fixated on the object ball.
And if you really watch his eyes during the shot, he's not just looking at the object ball, he's staring at it incredibly hard. But on the shot itself, what exactly is he looking at?
Well, I just told you, it's the object ball. But that's not the entire story, as his eyes clearly change position. So what exactly is he doing?
On his way to the shot, he's looking at where he wants to strike the object ball, and only when he gets settled on it does he flick his eyes down and look at where he's striking the cue ball and check that he's pushing it through to the right place on the object ball. Then he flicks his eyes up again, looking at the object ball, and keeps his eyes there as he plays the shot.
Steve Davis is similar to this, but not the same, as he flicks his eyes back and forth several times before striking the cue ball, not just once.
So I'm going to start this off by saying this one is not similar.
But what about the rest of his technique? How does he grip the cue?
Compared with most professional players these days, Yan actually seems to grip the cue quite tightly.
Obviously, if he held the cue too tight, he'd struggle to push it through. So how does he cope with this?
He seems to have a very firm grip with his thumb and forefinger in that sort of a position, and his other three fingers aren't exactly loose either.
Although they don't come away from the cue very much, they comfortably do enough to allow him to keep it parallel to the table. This will prevent the cue from wobbling around during the shot, but also won't have a detrimental effect on his cue action. Other than being a little bit tighter, this is very similar to Davis.
So I think grip-wise they are quite similar. So I think that makes it one each.
But Yan's wrist action will definitely change that.
As he pushes the cue through, he keeps his arm and wrist quite straight, although when he delivers it, he sort of pushes his fingers together at the top and the bottom, leaving a gap here, so he sort of pushes his wrist outwards as he plays the shot.
Even though the knuckle of his little finger seems to come away from the cue, both his cue and his arm seems to go through dead straight. I tried to mimic this, but it was very difficult, and when I actually play the shot here, you'll see both my arm and cue actually flick out wide. Yan, however, seems to make this work, and everything goes through in a straight line.
Even though for me this feels really different, I like how sturdy it feels. But does this stop Yan from having as much cue power as other players?
Well, as it turns out, Yan's cue power seems to be fairly good, so I decided to find out by attempting a long screw shot while using Yan's tighter grip and different wrist action.
So that's Yan Bingtao's wrist action, and that's pretty good. I mean, I've got about halfway back, but I was a long way from the red. So let's see what happens if I use my regular cue action, see what difference that makes. Move the brown out of the way. So it's a lot further back, but if you're able to pot a lot more consistently like that, then really that's not anywhere near as much of a disadvantage as it looks.
And good but not exceptional is probably also how you describe Steve Davis's cue power.
Yan's wrist action is probably the most unorthodox part of his entire technique, so it won't be a surprise when I tell you which way this one's going.
So at the moment the Tiger and the Nugget aren't looking too similar, although all of that could still change after we've looked at the rest of Yan's cue action.
But before we go any further, we're just going to find Dylan, who's from Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. Just there.
In a lot of ways you might describe Yan's cue arm as more or less perfect. When he cues up to the ball, his cue arm is very fractionally back from vertical. This isn't really a problem or that unusual, And this is actually very similar to Neil Robertson, more so than Steve Davis, who you'd probably describe as being fractionally the other side of vertical.
And his cue arm itself is very slightly leant over in that direction, just a fraction.
Compared with other professionals, this is actually quite straight, and having your arm in this position seemed to work quite well with his wrist action and grip, and again looks very similar to Mr. Davis.
So I think I'm going to say that that's 1 point for similar and 1 point for not so similar.
So let's move on to the way Yan stands at the table.
One of the reasons people are likening him to Steve Davis is he pretty much has the textbook Steve Davis stance.
This is a straight leg with a foot pointing outwards at about a 45-degree angle on the line of the shot, and a left leg with a bent knee that's about a foot length in front. So obviously this is also very similar. But how does his rest play work, because he seems to be pretty good with this piece of equipment?
Yan's rest play seems to be excellent, but there's nothing really unusual about the way he uses this thing.
So what do you have to do if you want to be able to play shots with the rest like Yan?
So if I could reach this shot normally, I'd be standing with my right foot behind my left foot. But with the rest, that's the other way round. I want my right foot forward now, so I'm standing with my left foot in line with the shot, and I'm standing with my right foot forward, so like the complete opposite to your normal technique. I'm bending my left knee a bit and keeping my right leg straight. One hand positioned on the rest just to keep it steady. You may have to lift it around at times, but it's better if you can just keep it flat on the table. And then with your other hand, you want 2 fingers wrapped around the cue like that. And with your other 2 fingers, sometimes players will have it pointing down the cue like that, and sometimes they'll just do what I do and place it underneath, wrapping it in between your 2 fingers and putting the other 2 fingers on the other side. And don't try to do anything perfectly with the rest. Just get into a position where it feels like everything's going to go right. And once you're there, just focus on the object ball and push your cue right through it.
Yan also managed to find an unorthodox way of using the spider, but is it a good idea?
This is one of those things where it's a good, innovative idea as long as he pots it, because this is a bit wobbly. And if he missed the pot and dropped his cue on the reds, everybody would be saying, why did he do that?
Steve Davis also seems to be a good rest player, and I haven't noticed anything unusual about his technique over the years, so I'm calling this one as fairly similar as well. One thing I did notice when looking at Yan's bridge and bridge arm is he seems to spread his fingers incredibly wide. Not only this, the position of his thumb appears to be very secure, and he seems to be able to keep his hand very flat to the table.
This isn't massively important, but it does mean his bridge hand will be rock solid and very reliable. But his bridge arm itself has a slight bend in it, which is fairly standard for most professional players.
And if you look at it from the front, once again it looks identical to Steve's. But are there any more similarities?
Before we find out more, we just got to look for Omar in Cairo in Egypt, which is there.
Steve was well known for never jumping off a shot too early or moving his head on the shot.
Staying down on the shot until well after it's been played is also something I've noticed a bit from Yan.
So again, I would have said this disciplined attitude to their technique is something the pair of them both have in common. Steve, of course, was well known for being a good tactical player.
Yan also appears to have a top-class safety game.
In fact, you could argue at 20 years old, Yan already has a very complete game. Good potting, tactical awareness, knowledge of the angles, safety, and of course is a very good break builder. So you could argue that Yan is the complete player, but is far more attacking than Davis ever was. But their styles of play may actually be similar than you think.
Towards the end of his career, you would have considered Steve to be a tactical player, but that's not how he would have been thought about during the 80s.
Especially in the early part of that decade, compared with a lot of the other players that were around at the time, Steve's game would have been considered to be very attacking.
If you make allowances for the era they played the game in, I think you consider their play styles to be very similar.
So these two players from different eras and vastly different backgrounds have more in common than you may expect. So were people right to ask the question, is Yan Bingtao the next Steve Davis?
So clearly his technique and the way he plays the game is very similar, but as a player he's probably more similar to someone like John Higgins.
Because he's a good all-round player, but one more suited to the modern era. But will he be the next Steve in terms of potential future success?
I think it's far too early to tell, and it's really just the snooker world getting excited about actually finding a young player who could be the future of the game.
All we can really say is he definitely has the ability and the technique, and if you want to find out more about professional snooker players' techniques, then have a look at these two videos about the technique of Neil Robertson and Ronnie O'Sullivan. And remember, don't just watch, play, and make the commitment to becoming a better player by subscribing to the channel and visit the website. See you later.